This podcast is about you. Are you ready? Take a moment and ask yourself, do I know the truth? And do I even care? Well, if you care at all, we have something for you. Stick around. We're a podcast that does not ignore the truth about life, people, or God. Larry Kutzler has been a pastor, a Bible commentator, a radio and podcast producer, and now is your host. This is a podcast you won't forget.
Idols in our hearts cause God to refuse to listen to our prayers. Ezekiel 14:3 says, "Son of man, these leaders have set up idols in their hearts. They have embraced things that lead them into sin. Why should I let them ask me anything?" Idol? What do you mean an idol? We think of an idol as a little carved image, and it, of course, is that. But it can be something else. An idol can be something you drive. An idol can be something you hold. An idol can be some passion you have in life that's more important to you than God.
We're about family idolatry. We take the family and we put it up on a pedestal, and basically we tell Christians, just build your entire life to protect the family. And Paul says, no, your marriage and your family exist to glorify and honor Christ. It's one of the dangers, by the way, of that term, first ministry, when it comes to family. It's your first ministry towards your ultimate ministry, but it's not the key ministry. Serving Christ is your ministry. So as a spouse and a married couple, your goal is to serve Christ. And the only way you'll ever have joy is if you're 100% all in committed to Jesus.
What in the world needs to be overcome? And the answer is the desires of the eyes, the desires of the flesh, and pride in possessions. Now, just step back from those three and just try to see a pattern there. If you don't have something you really want, you crave it, you desire. Now that's the first two, desire of eyes, desire of flesh. There's something out there I don't have, I really want it. It has a very high place in my affectional ranking, and I crave it. And the other one is, I already have it, and I'm really proud of having it. You see how the world works? Mingled with my sinful, unregenerate heart. The world's very powerful, and it can kill me in two ways. It can withhold itself from me, or it can give itself to me. Either way, I'm dead.
Nothing is more important in life than knowing God. No amount of money, fame, or success can ever compete with knowing Him. Our values are not in a system, a set of rules, or in the latest motivational book. Our values are in a person named Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us.
Well, when I have tough questions that I have about the Bible, Scripture, I always pull in my concordance guy, Dr. Jay Christianson. I call you my concordance because you seem to come up with verses and things that explain other things that I'm thinking about. And so we're here today. We're going to talk about idolatry, Dr. Jay. And it's not the idolatry that you and I and most people think about when we think about idolatry. We think about the negative. But I think there's a positive part of idolatry. Not that idolatry is ever positive, but there are positive elements in life that can be idolatry. And those are the kind of tough questions we want to talk about. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so just to be clear here, you're not talking that idolatry is good.
No.
You're just saying that there are good things in our lives that we can turn into idols.
Yes. Well, for example, here's a list that I came up with, okay? And it's not exhaustive by any means. I suppose when I mentioned this first one, everyone would say, well, there's nothing positive about politics, but there are things about politics that are positive. Secondly, theological viewpoints on the Bible. I mean, that's positive usually. Church life with success. Lots of big churches today, and we honor that kind of successful ministry. Charismatic leaders who are leading and guiding. Family, kids, and grandkids. This is all part of a positive deal. Reputation, status, career. Knowledge-based God, things that we talk about God and the concepts that we hear preached and studied. Number 8 is religious practices. There's a lot of good things in religious practices that remind us, so we go through those traditions. Race, good things being said about race most of the time. And number 10, justice, social, economic, and purpose. All of those are kind of positive. And yet every one of them, Dr. J, could be an idol. Too much emphasis. So how do we gauge that in our lives? I mean, when you talk about grandkids, for example, how can that ever be an idol?
Well, first, let's talk about baseline, what an idol is and what idolatry is. And we'll try to give this the quick 1 minute or 2 minute summary here. Okay? You ready to go?
I am.
Okay. Webster's dictionary says the worship of idols, idolatry is the worship of idols or excessive devotion to or reverence for some person or thing. Got that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, let's go farther back. Let's build this out. Do we have natural human desires, Mr. Larry?
Well, absolutely. And that's kind of where I'm going today. Those natural desires and the things that are good in our lives could be turned into an idol. But yes, to answer your question, absolutely.
Okay, good. One of the things that I found that kind of boils down all of the desires in our life is what we get from 1 John, where he talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. If you boil those down, the lust of the flesh is the desire to enjoy, the lust of the eyes is the desire to obtain, and the pride of life is the desire to achieve. When Eve was tempted by the apple, now you got to remember, this is the first temptation, and it played off of all three of these things. She saw the apple, she saw that it was good for food, it was pleasing to the eye, and it would grant her wisdom. Well, there you go. The lust of the flesh is to enjoy its taste. The lust of the eyes was to reach out and to obtain it, to take it unto oneself. And the pride of life is to achieve wisdom. The first temptation included playing off of all three of those desires. Now, God said, only do this my way. In other words, our desire to enjoy should only be satisfied his way. Our desire to obtain should only be satisfied his way, and our desire to achieve and how we achieve it should be done his way. That's the original paradigm. Well, when we walk away from God, now we want to enjoy what we want to enjoy, obtain what we want to obtain, and achieve what we want to achieve. And we will do it by any means we want. Now, because we've jettisoned God out of the equation of meeting our desires, that's idolatry. So anything that we seek to use or to justify satisfying our enjoyment, obtaining things and achieving things apart from God, idolatry. So understanding that kind of mechanism behind it helps us understand when something is good turns into something bad as an idol. You understand? You tracking with me here?
I am. I am tracking with you. Continue, or I have a verse I want to throw in here because John, as you mentioned him just a few minutes ago, has something to say about idolatry as well. And I think in the New Living Translation, he says it very well. So continue on.
So going back to what Webster says, idolatry is the worship of idols. Now, when I say that, everybody thinks, bowing before a little stone or metal statue, etc.
Right.
But it's the worship of that, giving worth to the thing that we think will meet our desires. Okay, that's the worship of an idol, or excessive devotion to or reverence for some person or thing. And what we've done is we've looked to that person or that thing, or even, like you said, politics and the other things in the list, as a way to meet what we want, as opposed to looking to God and saying, this is what I want. How should I meet it? To keep within your boundaries, Lord. Because if we seek to meet something apart from his moral boundaries, we step outside the line, and that's called sin. But if we stay within the boundaries, it's all good, and God gives a blessing on it.
Well, I love that explanation, Dr. J, but here's my problem, okay? John says this.
You got a lot of problems, but we'll start with this one.
You're right. Absolutely. We'll talk about that after the program. But anyway, he says in 1 John 5:21, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your heart." Now, I hear what you're saying, and you're kind of giving us a good overview. The psalmist also says that, he will give us the desires of our hearts. But again, it's a real tricky thing, I think, because some of these things that are good oftentimes drive our lives. And if something other than God is driving our lives, then I think it becomes an idol. What do you say?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, idols are so insidious that when we allow them to drive our lives, we drive God out of our lives. See, now, that's really good. I need to preach on that sometime. Anyway, but I like what gotquestions.org says about this.
Okay.
It says, don't even mention idols, because doing so, and this is what the Bible says, don't even mention them, because doing so would acknowledge their existence and give credence to their power and influence over you. So if you take politics and you put it in the place of God, you've turned it into an idol, you're acknowledging its power over your life or its influence over you. Okay, now we know that politics does have a certain degree of power and influence over our lives. I mean, that's our form of government. That's
Right.
how we organize society. That's how we function as a people. However, there are people that look not to God to fix things in society, but they run to politics right off the bat. So in other words, they look to man and a man-centered government for a solution, rather than look to God and say, what is the solution you want, and how should that guide the government decisions? So, you have issues that come up regarding the welfare state or abortion or illegal immigration or any of these things. A man-centered solution on illegal immigration is, well, we'll just look the other way. And we see this today, and I'm not getting overly political on this, but the government and politics today on one side says, well, we'll just overlook it and, we'll just make them citizens and we've solved the problem.
Right.
Except we haven't, because the country's being flooded with more and more people that are breaking down the infrastructure. However, what does God say? God says, if you come in here illegally, technically, you're stealing, because you're taking citizenship things for yourself. You're satisfying your desires for what? To enjoy, obtain, and achieve the things of citizenship apart from doing it legally. And God says, follow the laws of the land. So 1, you're breaking laws. Number 2, you're stealing. So if we did it God's way, we should say, well, maybe we should set up a legal way to do this, which we do. And number 2, enforce it so that people come in the boundaries of legality. Now, it's like then everybody who then becomes an immigrant is welcomed with open arms because they've gone through the right process, and we bless them when they come, as opposed to many people resenting them because now they're stealing things and thus taking things away from others. So a lot of people use politics as an idol to get what they want rather than looking to God first and say, how should I satisfy this area in my life, in my family's life, and my country's life?
I have found myself in recent years going back to the 10 Commandments for just a lot of answers, right? Supplying answers like, what an idol is. And of course, the very first commandment, God says, you shall have no other gods before me. So let's unpack that for a few minutes, because that was number 1. And I think if you violate that first commandment, you would probably violate all the other 9, or possibility you could, right? Because you're replacing God at the very beginning. Well, the church of Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2 did just that. I mean, that is a biblical example of what Moses was talking about in that first commandment, because they did everything right, Dr. J. I mean, we would look at the Ephesian church and say, aha, look at how good they are. And that's what Jesus did. But there was something wrong. They had replaced him with the success of their ministry. So that is another example of what I'm trying to get at, that positive things can turn into an idol and it doesn't please God. What say you?
Correct. They've left their first love, which means they've directed their love towards something else. And that's a really subtle point you brought up there, and I don't think you realized it, because throughout Scripture, idolatry is likened to adultery. Why? Because just as a man and a woman are in covenant to give to the other person and receive really their needs being met as much as they can through the other person, so that's really a picture of God and his people, and specifically Jesus and the church. It's a covenant relationship where we give God what he wants, he gives us what we want, and it works really well as long as you keep it within the boundaries. And so to commit idolatry on God, you're committing adultery. You're cheating on him. And so this is why God indicts. All these things in the list can fall into that. Does politics draw me away from God and cause me to focus my life on politics to the exclusion of God? Yeah, it can. I know a lot of Christians who have fallen into that. How do we know? Worship is that which we spend our time, talent, treasure, and efforts on. Do you spend more of your time, talent, treasure, and efforts on politics than you do God? Then maybe politics is an idol. What about theological viewpoints or the Bible? We differ in non-salvation theological points. Pre-trib rapture, post-trib rapture, Calvinism, Arminianism. But are you willing to violate God's law to love your neighbor as yourself by just ripping into somebody who disagrees with you theologically?
That's good.
If so, you have made theology an idol in your life. Because you are seeking to reassure yourself that your theological needs and spiritual understanding are being met while violating the core law of God's laws.
You're right, absolutely. But I have a stumper for you. I like stumping you, Dr. J, because it's I heard a preacher once say that people make the Bible an idol. And what he was referring to, it's like the Pharisees, what Jesus said to the Pharisees, you study the scriptures to find true life or find life, and I'm there, but you don't see me. People actually study the Bible thinking that somehow that's going to make them righteous. So they may spend hours a day reading the Bible, but they're not righteous because they haven't taken up the faith in Jesus Christ. So speak to that for a minute. I mean, it almost seems antithetical in a way that we say, well, the Bible could become an idol. That sounds pretty slippery to me. What do you think?
Okay, that's the difference between reading the word of life for information as opposed to interacting with the word of life for a relationship.
Okay, sure.
See, if you're just looking for knowledge, you get knowledge in the Bible. You can even find wisdom in the Bible. But if it doesn't lead or reinforce your relationship with Jesus, then it's just head knowledge. And that's what Jesus was indicting the Pharisees on. You read the scriptures thinking that in them you're going to find life because I'm life.
That's right.
You're completely bypassing me, guys.
Yeah. Very good.
And that's true. I mean, I know a lot of Christians who read the Bible. Sadly, a lot of them don't.
Yeah, right.
And to their shame, but they should read the Bible. But when they read the Bible, sometimes it's just to get the information, which in itself is not bad, but when it takes the place of a relationship with Jesus, it has become an idol. Hate to scare everybody out there, but true.
It is true, and religion can become an idol. I mean, I was raised in a tradition that said the church's tradition was equal to Scripture, and they taught that. And so often I have said that God hates religion, and some people bristle at that. But if you go through the Old Testament, you go through the New Testament, Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. He came to fulfill the relationship that he had with Israel in the Old Testament as, a relationship, not a religion. And the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament, people have made religion out of following Jesus. That's not what he wants. And if we make our religion an idol, that we put more time and energy into the practice of the religion and still don't know the Lord, that's an idol, right?
Well, yeah, as you were saying that, the thoughts were spinning through my head, and I like the way you put it, that God formed a relationship with Israel, and he gave them a process, which we would call a religion, on how to firm up and establish that relationship with him. Well, with Jesus, through his death and resurrection, now the door's opened to the Gentile world to enter into that relationship as well. Why? Because from the beginning, mankind fell out of a relationship with God. God's whole plan at the end is to bring all of humanity, as many who would come, back into relationship with him. That's the point. But if the focus becomes the process and not the person, you've missed it. So if you're going to church on a Sunday and you're just mouthing the lyrics of the worship songs, you're just kind of thinking about lunch during the service or during the prayer time, you're just kind of, worried about other things in life, and you're not truly engaging as if you were one-to-one with God. And yet you think that's okay. You've met your quota or whatever it is, and you think you're acceptable. Even God ripped on the Israelites for that. He said, if your hearts are not with me, he's going, why don't you just close those darn temple doors and put out the fires on the altar and go home? Because you're doing nothing here except going through an act. And you're trying to satisfy your desire for enjoyment, obtaining, and achieving. I mean, am I enjoying an experience with God? Well, sometimes we think we do, going through religious motions. Do we think we're obtaining something with that? Oh yeah, I think I'm obtaining a relationship with God. Am I achieving salvation? Oh yeah, if I just go through these religious rituals, I am. And God goes, wrong. You've missed it on all three counts. Because what we need to do, if we're doing this correctly, if we make God the focus of our lives, we are to enjoy him, we are to obtain a relationship with him, and achieve that everlasting presence with him. That's the goal. And if we do it any way apart from him, it's an idol.
Good thought. Say, you and I do a program together called The Truth Barista, and every once in a while you say, okay, Amazing Larry, you call me Amazing Larry on the program. Yep. You want to test me, and you always test me with things I can't answer. So I'm going to test you now. The tables are turned. You're on my program, so I'm going to turn the tables on you, and I'm going to test you.
Are you playing Stump the Truth Barista now?
I am playing Stump the Truth Barista. Actually, it's not that much of a stump, but you are an expert, I would say, in the Old Testament because you understand the customs, you understand the language, and so forth and so on. So here's my stumping question, if it is a stump. That is, in the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, there was one main sin that came up again and again and again and again. And it seemed like it was always the same thing, over and over again. What was that?
Idolatry.
You win. Ding, 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 ding. How can you get it right and I never get your questions right? I don't get that. I guess I'm easier on
I could have a lot of fun, but that would waste time. Anyway, it's an important point because God says from the very beginning, going back to the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And that phrase is, you will not recognize any other gods in front of me. In other words, he is the one supreme being in the entire universe. All other spiritual beings that people call gods are beneath him. And so he says, don't you even dare recognize one of those beings as on par with me, because they are not. Well, and the problem then, whether it's following a spiritual being represented by a statue or making ourselves on par with God, which is the original sin in Genesis 3, is putting ourselves on par with God. I can make my decisions. I can satisfy myself exactly as I want. Well, the core problem is we have made ourselves the idol. And all idolatry stems from ourself. That's why the beginning of idolatry and the middle of the word sin is I. Mm-hmm. It's all about us. Now, if we take I out of the equation and we put God in the middle of it, then idolatry it's not even a possibility because we have focused on him. So we are not to recognize anything else as the source of what we need in life or in the present or in the future. And we'll stay out of the idolatry thing. The problem is, even though we have been freed from our sin nature that makes it impossible for us to live righteously, now we can live righteously and we can resist sin, we still fight against the desires and whether we're going to satisfy those or not. We are, as James says, lured and enticed by our own desires. Well, congratulations. You have a new nature and you can say, choose between doing this myself or doing this God's way. If I choose God's way, bingo, it's great. But if I do it that way, I've instantly fallen into idolatry because I'm satisfying myself. That's the problem. And that's what I think you're talking about.
Well, you're absolutely right. I wonder if we do enough decluttering of idols in our lives. First of all, being self-aware that I'm spending more time, energy, money replacing God, really, with other things. And are we aware of that? And should our leaders be talking about decluttering from idols and making that a case, because it can be a problem in our lives to the point where we could be going to church, sitting there in the pew, listening, but we're not hearing anything because there's an idol taking our time and our energy and our resources. Should we talk more about idols in the church?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you were talking there, what struck my heart was we're in a time period right now where there's an immense amount of evil just flooding through the land. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about the 3 I's of idolatry, which would be immorality, idolatry, and innocent blood. Those are the 3 things that the scriptures say defile the land. Idolatry, immorality, as in sexual immorality, and innocent blood. In our days, that would be turning away from God, just bathing ourselves in sexual immorality, and the taking of innocent life through abortion. Those 3 things are running rampant through our nation right now. And you know something? I don't hear the church on a national level speaking so much about it. There are voices here and there. There are organizations that are doing a tremendous work. And in fact, I think sometimes a greater work than the organized church is doing. But what I think we need a great national self-examination. I think the leaders should take a week or a month. And I'm talking whether you're a pastor or an elder, or, apostle, prophet, pastor, teacher, elder, deacon, whatever. They should just all say, we're stopping this for a week or 2 or a month. And we're going to say, are we really doing God's business here? Are we really representing him? Are we building his kingdom? Or are we focusing on ourselves? Are we doing our business? Or are we building our kingdom? Mm-hmm. What's the point? See, the big charge that's coming down against Christians today is you're a bunch of Christians who want Christian nationalism. You want to use politics in an idolatrous way to force everybody into acting Christian. A reasonable, sensible, honest Christian would say, no, we don't want Christian nationalism because it doesn't change the human heart, and that's where idolatry resides. What we need is a nation of Christians. Christians who have hearts for God and are pursuing him and his ways. That will influence the culture. That makes us salt. That makes us light. And despite what's going on in the culture, if Satan doesn't have a toehold, he won't stick around. Well, the reason he can stick around is you got a bunch of idolatrous Christians who are walking away from God and not embracing him. They've embraced the culture, not the Christ. So really, from my standpoint, that's my little rant for the day. But that's what I see. I see a bunch of non-serious Christians out there. They're not reading the Word. They don't have a biblical worldview. Those are just simply symptoms that they're steeped in idolatry.
Right.
And they're not focusing on God.
Well, George Barna says, I think we're 7 or 9% in the evangelical community that have a worldview, a Bible worldview or a Christian worldview, and that's really shameful, really, when you think about 300,000-400,000 churches in America. We're not really convincing people to have a biblical worldview more than 7 or 9%, and that is really unbelievable. Last but not least, Dr. J, when you go back to the Hebrew Scriptures and the example of Joseph in Egypt, and Potiphar's wife was tempting him for sexual immorality, he basically said the very first thing he said is, God, I do not want to sin against you. And that simply says to me, there were no idols in his life. There was nothing there other than the fear of God, the love of God, the honor of God, and he would not sin with her. And I wonder where that spirit might be today, because it seems like we're just falling apart as a nation, and sometimes even within the church. I'll give you the last word on that.
I think you're absolutely right when you point that out. And what came to my mind as you were saying that is the fault of many Christians I perceive today. I don't care if I sin against you, God. I don't care about not sinning against you, God. I will do it my way. That really is the essence of idolatry. And what we need to get back to is, I am aware, God, of your presence. I am aware that if I do this, I will sin against you. I will choose not to, because I will love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my strength, and with my mind. And that idea of love in the Hebrew scripture often has to do with remaining faithful to a covenant. That means covenant faithfulness. So you shall remain covenantally faithful to God. You promised to be faithful to your relationship with God as a wife promises to be faithful to her husband and a husband to the wife. And again, getting back to idolatry, it's spiritual adultery. If you want to stay faithful to God, that means I have to exclude all other spiritual lovers or anything of this world that would draw my attention and my affections away from God that I serve. That's really where we need to be as a church today.
Well, Dr. J, I love it. Every time we get to be behind microphones and talk like this, I learn something, I'm challenged by something. And if our audience is challenged by you, Dr. Jay Christianson, how can they find out more about who you are and what you do?
I invite everybody who hears this to go to highbeamministry.com, HIGHBEAM, like our high beams, highbeamministry.com. On that website, you'll find all of the archived radio programs of the Truth Barista, past podcasts. We have the blog articles, books, all sorts of resources for you to go to. As Amazing Larry and I have delved through the scriptures and various cultural topics. And as you've heard, we don't shy away from taking on the tough stuff and calling out what we see. We are not all shaking fingers at culture, but we are also offering solutions and hope. So we encourage you today, if you're listening to this message, take time to reset your relationship with God, put him first, and throw out the idols, and we'll see a change in your life and hopefully in the culture.
This isn't the end. It's only the beginning of your journey to trust God for the truth you never want to lose. We can help. Log on to citysitesurbanmedia.com today. Remember, there's only one truth and only one God, and you should know them both.